Hello, everybody. So welcome back to another fun episode of Examining the Witness. This episode is going to be different from some of the previous ones we've done because we've been going area by area, right? But there's also a lot of cross-connecting themes and things like that. So we still have a few more areas to go. Like we have to do the town, even though I'm playing currently on a save game where the town has been completed. And then there's like a bunch of ending stuff. Like a third of the game is like underground, basically. So we'll see if I ever get through all of the crazy caves and things. But today's episode is going to be about the island itself, sort of like the setting, like the geology, like where is the island, kind of how it was designed. And this will probably / hopefully be a shortish episode, and then in 2 or 3 weeks we'll do a big exciting one about the civilizations of the island, right? Because there were sort of like 3 civilizations over time that lived here, and that's sort of present. Of course, the Witness is all about nonverbal communication, so this doesn't show up in like a literal story, but it's nonetheless kind of an important part of the story of the game and what it's trying to communicate. So as a kind of lead up to talking about the people who came to the island, who they were, what they stood for, what they built, that kind of stuff. In this episode, we're going to be talking about like the geology and the ecology and the climate and all that kind of thing. So we'll just start off with that kind of natural history. So a lot of the stuff that I'll have to say, both in this episode and the one about the civilizational history of the island, comes from this really cool blog post, which I will put in the description of the video, from an architecture studio that was actually hired by Jonathan Blow and pals to work on the game. And there's kind of a funny story that is related in this blog post about how the architecture studio was they were had fallen on hard times, basically. I think they're based in LA, and the Witness began production in 2008, right? That's when Braid came out, was like summer of 2008, and so the early ideas of the Witness started happening then. And then but that was also when this giant housing financial crisis happened, and like residential investment collapsed overnight, never to return again, unfortunately. So it was a real hard time for architecture studios out there, and so they were like, let's just do a bunch of weird contract work. We'll like enter some design competitions for like how to create a Mars base, like things like that. And one of the things they did was get hired by Thekla to be advisors on this game. So I thought that just struck me as something very funny, because I think of The Witness as such a timeless game about these like high philosophical themes and stuff. But like everything is kind of historically contingent and just dependent on the economy. Like if this game had been done like, I don't know, today, when like there's lots of architecture firms are pretty busy, or a few years earlier in like 2006 in the midst of the housing bubble and stuff, then we probably would not have this like really nice plausible architecture to everything in the game, and instead maybe the attention would have gone to somewhere else, like having fancier graphics or having a bigger island with more puzzles, or who knows. So that's kind of interesting. But before we get to talking about the architecture, I want to start with the most basic question, which is, where is the island, right? Like, it has all these different wacky biomes. Like, we have this cool olive grove, but then there's like tropical forest elsewhere. There's these apple trees, which are like in springtime because they're blossoming and the apples haven't grown in yet. But then, of course, there's the fall forest. So there's obviously a, kind of exaggeration going on in the game and mixing together lots of different things. Like, there's like a Zen monastery, and then there's like a medieval Christian church. So it's like a collage of different stuff. But it also overall has this kind of Mediterranean vibe, you might think. Like, you know, like maybe this is like ancient Greece, you know, which is famous for being a kind of philosophical Renaissance time period where a lot of influential thinkers all came together and like influenced world history and stuff. And despite very small population, right? So like this town is kind of cartoony small again, but that's also part of the message in a way. If you remember the audio log from the very beginning there about Einstein talking about the society of true searchers that has very few living members at any given time. It's like a small number of people. This is kind of a, you know, it's a project of like people writing things and then passing them down to other people and stuff like that. And in that respect, you know, it's kind of remarkable to hear the stories about like ancient Athens, which was so foundational for the world, and which only had a population of like 150,000 people, which is like the same as this small town Fort Collins in Colorado that I currently live in. But like Fort Collins' biggest impact on history is like, I don't know, they have a community college, you know, they have some nice bike trails, versus Athens was like inventing democracy and also philosophy at the same time. So I guess Athens, sorry, correction, they had about 150,000 citizens, and then they had about an equal number of like non-citizen foreigners and slaves and stuff, but still. So yeah, yeah. So, but actually, so The Witness is kind of Mediterranean in vibe, but they wanted something a little bit more exotic feeling and a little bit more isolated, with kind of like an Easter Island type feel of like something far away from the rest of the world, not all tied in the middle of things. So they actually tried to. They use the Azores Islands as a model. So these are some islands off, and we'll put a picture up of this, but these are some islands off the coast of Africa, or actually quite far into the Atlantic Ocean, that are owned by Portugal, I think. So that same kind of like idyllic, temperate, you know, Mediterranean type thing, or kind of like Bermuda, but very isolated, just, you know, off doing their own thing. Personally, and this also to me feels a little bit like some of the utopian fiction that I've like the original book Utopia by Sir Thomas More, or like the book The New Atlantis by Sir Francis Bacon, I think. And both of those have this imagined world where like there's like an island in the southern hemisphere. I think the new Utopia is older, and it's imagining that it's like in the South Atlantic, and there's a sort of like parallel upside down Europe down there that's like temperate, kind of like New Zealand or something. That's like a temperate civilized world, but you know, like far away from existing civilization. And of course they have all this utopian stuff, and they've solved all these problems. So anyways, it's kind of interesting to pick like a far away kind of mythic place, but without the sort of exoticizing mysticism of like a Shangri-La valley in between mountains, or something like that. So I've never personally been to the Azores, but I have been to the Galapagos, which has a similar kind of vibe of like temperate Mediterranean style islands, like very sunny and paradise-like. And you know, with the weird different themes of the different islands, you know, the different finches and stuff, and volcanoes and things. That also, it felt similar to this in that it was like it felt like so many different geographies had been compressed into a single place.
I mean, that's what's cool about islands, right? Is you can see like islands young and then aging.
Yeah. And yeah, in fact, that leads in nicely to but if you want more about the Portugal thing, so the artist, one of the main artists on the game, Luis Antonio, has a great series of blog posts called The Art of the Witness, and I will also link that in the video description. It's a super cool series of posts. You can see a bunch of like in progress stuff from like developing each area, or like developing the art style around things like the panel puzzles, and just solving various graphical problems and stuff. It's interesting to see kind of the artist's perspective on like how they put together the style and shape of the game while keeping in mind all the different constraints and like paying attention to all the kind of different bits of direction that Jonathan Blow had given the team. And in particular, he talks about how the starting castle, which is kind of like a fantasy castle, sort of like dream world, like kind of, I don't know, like knights and princesses type thing, was inspired by a Portuguese castle that he visited on vacation. Luis Antonio also made the game 12 minutes, which is a cool game. But anyways, so yeah, you were talking about what were you talking about?
The island ages?
Yeah. About how like in Hawaii and like in a volcanic island chain, you see the new islands coming up and stuff like that.
Islands, the ones that have been colonized and overgrown, and the eroding islands into the ocean.
Yeah. And on the Witness, we can see that very geological process is happening, right? So up top at the mountain, it's a volcanic island, and apparently the volcano part of the story was like much bigger in the plot earlier on than, which we'll get to in the civilization part. Like the early draft notes from this architecture studio are like literally like the people worship the volcano, and then like there was an eruption and it killed the town and then scientists came and they built a science building on top of the volcano. I think they felt that was too tacky, so they kind of backed off on the volcano stuff, but it is still
cool.
It's still an obviously volcanic island, which is why the center is hollow, right? And there's like a giant lab in there, and we have all these basalt columns, which is like a volcanic feature.
It is, but it doesn't really make sense to have like a whole like this is. These basalt columns form when there's like a magma chamber that has been like slowly cooling. So it doesn't make sense
to have them all around the
outside
of a living volcano. But whatever. It's volcanic rock.
Yeah,
it communicates that
volcano-ness
is happening. So that's on the volcano itself, and then most of the island is like apparently granite, according to the architecture firm, which does not jive with it being a small isolated island with this volcanic, because usually volcanic stuff is made out of basalt, and then granite is like the hard, it's like the the bedrock of like continents and stuff.
More pressure.
I remember reading about the evolution of continents on the Earth, and early on the Earth had all these shallow seas, in part because like the continents hadn't had time to lift up yet or something, so they would just be these volcanic like basalt based island chains, but the basalt is really weak, so it erodes really easily, versus granite is strong enough that it can like actually poke up and be a continent and not just get eroded away into the ocean. So all this random nondescript rock out here is like granite stuff, except for this chunk over here, which I gotta assume is marble, because they're carving a bunch of statues out of it, right? And they're carving it into blocks, as people have historically done for or limestone, maybe, right? Because then they're also grinding it up and making cement out of it, which is a classic.
I'm not very good at telling it, but I would guess limestone. I don't really know much about marble versus limestone versus other white quartz or rocks.
Yeah. So there's that, but this is also kind of just like a more geologically normal. It's not a super young rocky mountain landscape thrusting up into the sky. It's like hills and valleys. There's like rivers and little canyons and stuff. The symmetry area is like heavily kind of wind sculpted. There's like dirt and things that built up.
Sedementary, like sandstone and stuff.
Yeah. That's kind of interesting. So we got like harder like granite and limestone on this side, and then like sandstone in the symmetry area. And we'll go over there now, because then at the farthest part of the island from the mountain, we have this big desert, right, where this kind of limestone is sinking down, and then over here we have the sandstone that builds up, right? And the sandstone is very easily eroded, hence the natural rock bridges and things, and little mesa shapes. And then over here, the island is basically like crumbling into the ocean, which is kind of poetic because the ruins of the ancient civilization are here, and they're also crumbling on a shorter time scale. And so we have this kind of so the civilization and the geology sort of line up together, where we'll just go over here where we have the last couple columns, that were once like parts of the island, are kind of like breaking off, almost like a sinking boat or something, and like collapsing into the sea. And we have these waves coming in, slowly kind of chipping away at these bluffs over here. So this is like the oldest, most ancient, forgotten part of the island. And this also has the oldest civilization. And then we have the middle part of the island that has all these medieval kind of stuff. And then around the mountain is clustered the most sci-fi stuff, right? You have all these lasers coming together from the people who put these high-tech laser beams all around. And you have also the scientific kind of like marsh area and the kind of fancy like color bunker zone are both like high technology zones. And then of course the very top and the inside are like magic sci-fi zones with light bridges and teleporters and flying elevators and things. So that's what I can say about the geology of the island. Again, it doesn't really make sense to have granite and limestone and sandstone and basalt all together in like 1 square kilometer or something, or like an area the size of Disneyland, but it's like a compressed vision, I guess.
Compressed time, compressed seasons, compressed geology.
Yeah.
It's neat.
Yeah. So another question, I guess, is the sort of meteorology of the island and the climate zones, right? So they wanted to have this kind of classic cartoon thing or video game thing, although video games always go so over the top of this. It's like Ice World, Lava World, in their levels. And I love a game that'll just be like, this is like a swamp world and this is like Savannah or something. So The Witness wanted to do that classic video game environmental variety, but without going like to crazy levels. But it did want to have things be laid out in a somewhat logical manner, even though they're compressed, right? So like this desert out here is like the hottest, most kind of barren and, like hot and dry part of the island. And then way up on top of the mountain, there's even a bunch of snow. So that's like the coldest part of the island just due to altitude. And in general, there's a bit of logic around like where the sun is and where, what the prevailing winds are and things like that. So I guess this side, what Jonathan Blow once referred to as the easy side of the island with the intro tutorials and the symmetry area and the desert, which is not that easy. In fact, it was one of the last areas that I got, but whatever. It's pretty dry, right? You have desert, and then it's adjacent to this sort of like mesa thing, and then you have kind of like Mediterranean olive grove orchards and things out there. Versus, I should get into a better central position. Over the wettest part of the island is over there, where you've got like tropical rainforest and stuff, and then just kind of blending into like, this is sort of like wetland swamp over by the marsh, and then separating the super wet side of the island from the dry side, we have this more temperate zone where it's just a bunch of trees, a flower field, kind of, and then like more trees here. So yeah, so they kind of line things up on a gradient of hot or wet to dry, and there's also a little bit of a gradient of cool to warm. So over here in like this corner with the shipwreck, you have, I guess mangroves are associated with pretty warm stuff like Florida or whatever, but anyways, you got like eucalyptus and like cattails and things, and a bunch of temperate trees. Like this kind of feels like the second coldest part of the island after all the snow that's up on top of the mountain.
You have evergreens back.
Yeah, it's kind of shaded by the castle and stuff, versus over on more towards the
jungle and
shore side. Yeah, you have this jungle and palm trees and stuff, and even like the trees over here are not pines. They're like, what do you call this? what's the type of tree? Like deciduous versus coniferous? Yeah, so they're deciduous trees over here. So, yeah. So it's kind of nice how they lined up the biomes a little bit. And things like the bamboo forest being at a slightly higher elevation, like it's up there because bamboo grows at a little bit higher elevation than just like tropical jungle down at the bottom. So it's just, they paid attention to that stuff. Let's see. There's also some of these beaches are like this beach has a ton of big waves hitting it, and then so I think the main wind direction is supposed to be like coming basically in the direction that this wacky laser is pointed right now. It's supposed to be like coming from over here. This beach, you can see there's like all this stuff washed up on it. Like they have big tides and big waves that are like crashing these bits of driftwood and just random floaty stuff up onto the shore, and then
I just realized there's no shells because there's no life.
I guess so.
No animals.
Yeah, they could put little shells here, but and then you have this harbor, which is very calm water, but that's because it's protected by this bay, and then it continues to be real rocky around here. Of course, incongruously it's super flat water in the symmetry area because it has to give a perfect reflection, and so that's also kind of a bay. Actually, I should just summon the boat and then we can look at the map. Yeah, so the symmetry island is in a little bay. There's like kind of more waves hitting this part, showing that it's like eroding, but then the water is very gentle around the back, right? This is like marshy, more like mangrove tree area is like super flat and muddy and marshy, and the water drops off pretty shallowly. You can see stuff on the bottom of the ocean. You can see like the bottom of the ship when you sail under it. So I think the overall wind direction is sort of like coming here, like coming from over the tutorial zone, or from over there, and then blowing over towards with this side kind of in the lee of everything. One quote from Luis Antonio in that blog post of his is, he says about the beach and jungle area, I learned quite a bit from the landscape architects, like how palm trees are supposed to have dry leaves at the bottom if they aren't artificially removed, or the way vegetation grows at the edges of beaches in order to maximize the sun exposure. And then elsewhere in the blog post with the architects, it says the game has heather fields, orchards, an invasive weed garden, deciduous forests, flower gardens, a tropical rainforest, cypress groves, dwarf manzanita, brutally pollarded sycamores. I think that's referring to
It's when you cut the tops off.
Yeah, but where are those in the game?
That is going to be in Mangrove. That's the mysterious.
Yeah. When they're all chopped up. Swamps, pine forests, palm groves, a bamboo forest, and one ancient and sacred fig tree, which I think is growing through the monastery there. Yeah. So then you have this big, huge tree. It's like they wrote about this as like doing the like emergent layer thing in the rainforest, where they'll have a tree tops and they'll have the super huge ones that come up above and are kind of like a landmark for birds and other creatures. Of course, it also participates in a few environmental puzzles.
Should keep a list of all those things, and I'll see if I can point them out.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, it's kind of nice, and yeah, I've got nice plants all throughout the witness. The tree up at the top of the sound area is what's this type of tree that grows the additional branches?
I thought this was also the fig.
Oh man, maybe it is. Yeah, no, this.
I think they're both figs. I think that's just slightly
Is it?
incorrect.
And they're doing the same thing. Yeah, because it's dropping down stuff on the inside as well,
and isn't
I
that
think.
incredibly poetic, because like just having
Like outside versus inside.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe so. I lived in Indonesia for a year a long time ago, and we went to a park, like it was like a city block, and the whole park was this one tree that had done this just 100 times and had created this whole mini forest that was all one big giant tree. So it's pretty cool. They drop these little roots and then go into the ground and then just keep going and supporting themselves. Okay.
I also have a memory of that. I think I was in Mexico. Yeah, I don't remember where it was anymore, but I also remember encountering a tree like that, and it's very memorable.
Yeah. Let's see, does this do the same thing?
Yep.
Yeah, it is. It's the same type of tree. Fig, I guess.
Yeah, it could be strangler fig, but I think there might be other trees that do it as well.
Yeah. So one thing that I thought was particularly kind of interesting and funny about this architect's blog post is they talk about this area with these all these plants here, which they describe as follows. They call it the weed garden. The weed garden is overtaken with pampas grass, eucalyptus, phragmites, and Spanish moss. To the average user, it is serene and peaceful, but to a restoration ecologist, it is terrifying. Yeah, that's a pretty funny touch, because I briefly, when I was playing this, noticed the phragmites, because I had That's this stuff, right? This big swaying thing?
Yeah.
So explain what's bad about each of these. What's annoying? There's 2 types of phragmites, and there's a kind that came over from Europe and started killing everything.
Incredibly
It's beautiful, it just sways in the wind.
So phragmites is native to the United States. However, there was not even a separate species. The same species had a trait, basically, a sub. You could call it a subspecies.
Just
you could call it just a trait.
Yeah.
That came over here. Now, the fun thing about Phragmites is that it doesn't even, it can, clone itself as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interbreeding / cloning itself, and now it's just taking over. And
just because it's outcompeting the other grass or something?
Yeah, so it outcompetes the native Phragmites type.
Yeah, but
it also just completely covers entire areas.
Yeah, which is what makes it look so cool, because it does this whole thing
pretty,
where if you guys have played, what's that Japanese game, Ghost of Tsushima?
Yeah.
It goes hard on Phragmites.
or found grass or pampas grass.
Yeah.
Pampas grass also does the same thing, where it's got that kind of fluff.
Yeah.
But yeah, so the problem is mostly just it takes over, and then it'll clog all the water, and then you don't have water flow and all this stuff. Basically, it'll change the landscape, and that freaks people out. Yeah. Same thing for the eucalyptus.
So that's these trees right here, right?
Yeah, which were a big mystery.
And these are from Australia, right? They're they're Australian trees. Is this the ones that koalas eat and the leaves are toxic?
Yes, yeah.
And they just suck eating those leaves?
Super toxic, but more relevant to us, because we don't care if nothing can eat the plants, is the bark, which actually this is how I can kind of tell this is eucalyptus, is the bark is all this weird peeling stuff. Yeah, there might be even some on the ground in front of you. Yeah. And so it'll peel off. It'll make this big pile of peeled off bark.
Yeah, it sheds an incredible amount of bark and leaves and stuff compared to a normal tree.
Yes. And then that stuff is very flammable because there's dried out bark on the ground. And then it'll start fires intentionally, basically, because it's better fire.
Yeah, so it sheds a bunch of tinder, and then it catches fire, but the eucalyptus is planned for this and is a fire-adapted tree.
Yeah, the tree
so then everything else will burn.
Will die, but it'll plant new
yeah. And this was particularly common all across California. The whole Stanford campus in Palo Alto is covered in eucalyptus. People introduced it. Yeah, because it grows well in a kind of California Mediterranean climate.
It grows very fast.
But then it becomes a massive fire hazard and drops all the stuff. And
it's very pretty.
Maybe smells weird. I don't know.
You should look up rainbow eucalyptus, because the bark is just stunning.
Yeah. And then
the Spanish moss.
Yeah, Spanish moss. What's the problem with that? I always thought Spanish moss is cool.
I don't think that there's that much of a problem with it. However, I will say that it's not moss, and it probably isn't Spanish, but I don't know that for sure. I don't know. It just grows on clumps. It looks like any environment that's not used to a new type of plant or system will just have less species that'll interact with it better, or the plants that are there aren't used to having all this weight, things like that. I kind of have my doubts that it causes that much of a problem, but maybe I just don't know.
Yeah, so I thought this was
and also in general, like a lot of trees will get tons of moss on them or lichen, and people
make it really
always,
heavy and stuff.
well, they worry that it's bad for the tree. That like, isn't that going to cause mold? Isn't that going to cause? And it's like, no, the trees are fine. They're adapted to that. Spanish moss, maybe not so much.
So, I mean, first of all, I just thought that was hilarious of putting like a ecology joke into a video game. But trying to like intentionally, I mean, it almost ties into like some of the mindfulness things of like, look, I'm going to create this beautiful thing that like is technically bad, and like we would be trying to eliminate it because they're all non-native species taking over.
Yeah.
But you know,
it's like, but the
like
object
we're gonna
itself, like when you look at it,
it's
right?
like it's not. It's like God didn't label it a weed. You know,
Yeah.
like it's just people that make it like that. So so that's sort of interesting content.
It'll like flip your perspective really quickly depending upon what you know about.
Yeah. So that's kind of interesting. And then it also, in the context of this particular area, is really interesting because as if you guys remember my video about the marsh area, I talked all about how my wife co-caster here noted that there's this fun kind of complementarity between the marsh and the color bunker, where the marsh is like doing science outside and you know taking the lab out into the natural world, and then the color bunker is like taking nature and you know putting it under a microscope and doing hydroponics and stuff like that. And of course the themes of the area in terms of what science is being done is being different here. They seem like they're studying kind of biology and bacteria and ecology and chemistry and stuff that's sort of in the middle sciences that aren't as relevant to the witness's interest, versus in the color bunker they seem like they're studying like, I don't know, color and perception. It seems more directly about consciousness and perception and sort of where the rubber hits the road of like science being able to make tractable progress on philosophy. But still they're doing a bunch of science here, and they're clearly like trying to manage the different areas. Like they've created these different like chemical pools. They're like A/B testing different techniques. I mean, real ecologists do this all the time, right? They're like, oh, we'll treat this one pond and then we'll compare it to how the other pond with a different pH level. Yeah. And so it's funny that this like is hyper overtaken with invasives, right? Because it's sort of like a suggestion that like it's all going wrong, you know, and or like it's like a cleanup zone or something like that. So that's kind of just a joke about like man's impact on nature. So it's like very subtle compared to something like you know, like the castle where you have all these political statues about how people are oppressed and stuff. This, I don't know, just seems so idyllic, but maybe it's like kind of a political message here about like, well, we don't really know how to manage things in like the complexities of the real world where there's all kinds of different variables.
I think it's just, I don't think it's making a comment on that. It's just observing that is sort of the state of the world.
Or it's kind of an emergent meaning or something. Another thing that I took away from reading the architecture blog post is just how many specific details that the architects brought to the table that people like Jonathan Blow just would not have known about. And so it's easy to see the witness because it's so cohesive. It's easy to imagine that like it was all just this mastermind product of one guy, you know, but really like there's a lot of little architecture details that, you know, mostly just add a lot of plausibility. Like I remember listening to a podcast interview or something with Jonathan Blow about the game, and they were asking why he hired architects, or he was talking about that, and he said he was telling a story of when he was playing some game, like, you know, probably Skyrim or something, and he came across this like huge fantasy bridge, you know, like to some grand city, and he noticed that the bridge was actually like a crappy like wooden footbridge, like that was meant to go across a little river, and the designer had just taken it and like scaled it up by like 10x to create this massive bridge that like a platoon of Roman legionaries could march across, you know, and he just obviously thought that was so ridiculous and like immersion breaking and stuff, you know, there's so little thought went into it, and he didn't want to have a game like that. So here you have like this kind of like realistic-ish like kind of Louisiana type architecture with the, you know, corrugated steel and everything, you know, built the like elevated walkways to stay above, you know, these muddy, swampy paths, just like you have, and how it stays elevated, not just as soon as it hits where the water currently is, right? But you want to keep it elevated. Or we were just freaking out in the previous episode about the marsh area when we noticed that the marsh area platform could like rise up and down with the tides.
All the little stuff is really neat.
Yeah, all kinds of stuff.
As you're saying, like, that means that even though it's sort of all one guy's vision, it's like actually a whole team contributed to all of these pieces making it into one vision.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They have. I mean, so there's a bunch of stories about some of these things. I think this was from some of those Luis blog posts of the Art of the Witness, talked about designing this fortress area, and talking about how the height of the walls, right? Of course, if you want to keep enemies out, it doesn't matter how objectively like high above sea level your walls are. It matters like how high they are above the local ground. So like this is a little bit higher. So this wall is consequently a little bit higher than this one, you know? And then also this is more exposed. There's not as much trees and stuff around it. And so this is the higher pillar, even, you know, if you look at the undecayed part. But this has been eroded more because it's like more exposed to the elements, you know, so they just put in a lot of thought about that kind of thing. And if you look at early concept art so like this castle is something that's been in the game since like the very beginning, but initially it just was like a crazy programmer art castle with like a wacky like like crenellated or whatever you know, it's like how a kid would draw a cartoon castle. And actually the intro area is a bit closer to that cartoon castle look because it's more of a fantasy castle versus this is more about like, you know, actual combat and stuff. So this will have like, you know, it's got like the slots where the boiling oil pours out and like the little portcullis things that slide up. It's got like nice vaulting on the inside and then more like slots for people to like throw stones down. They have boiling oil marks on the floor where, you know, like they thought about it, as usual for the Witness. They thought about it. So all those little architecture details are really great. The architects also had to find creative solutions to not putting circles anywhere or having anything beyond circular wheels or, you know, things like that. So
the wheels of the mica are the favorite thing for me. Like, man, I stare at those square wheels going like, is there a reason these wheels are, like, is there a purpose you'd ever have square wheels on a mica?
Yeah. Apparently the monastery was, quote, it was recycled from, quote, a representation of a winning competition entry in which a tree providing the structural armature for a sacred building, like a living mortar and the walls of Angkor Wat. The tree is both holding the structure together and tearing it apart. So that was kind of neat. They had some architectural background on that. And they also had some reference that was like way too postmodern in architecture for me. But I've always wondered why these tree houses have this like weird like hyper modernist kind of look to them where they're all angular and stuff.
Yeah, what does it mean?
But so this is like some freaking like Arcasanti type stuff, or like Frank Lloyd Wright type stuff. They say the faceted tree houses relate to a lecture on the oblique by Hashim Sarkis. His course, Construction Vision, made a good deal of how we approach the Witness possible. So they provide some weird link to his bunch of videos about lectures on the oblique in architecture.
That's awesome.
But yeah, so they're, you know, just putting some fancy architecture theory into practice. So that's that for all the you know, for that blog post. But just the detail of thought of the architecture comes up constantly in the game. Like, again, in the town, you have kind of a gradient where the side that's closer to the trees and the mountains is more preserved, and then the other side is more ruins because it's more exposed. You have like structures like this where the stone part survives, but then the roof is fallen in. You know, you just have like, and there's always a ton of attention given to like bracing and you know, supports and stuff. So like this like used to be a stone bridge and then it fell apart and then it's been replaced using sort of like, you know, this same panel style architecture of like screwing metal stuff in to communicate like, oh, this, like, it was ancient and then it was replaced by the modern civilization with little steel and stuff like that. This bridge also reflects a theme that I'm going to talk about in the civilization part about the ancient civilization being a little bit more long-term oriented, and then one of the drawbacks of, in many ways, modern civilization has a lot of advantages for understanding truth and stuff, but we're maybe also a little bit impatient or not aware that we're part of this larger intergenerational civilizational project. So anyways, it's a cool representation of that kind of thing. But
So it definitely doesn't suffer from the scaling of the bridge issue. Everything does have the proper amount of bracing force, things that are that size. Which is maybe why it looks realistic.
Yeah, yeah. So that's that for the kind of architecture blog post. They ended with a really nice quote, namely that what is it? The game was published in January of 2016 to resounding critical and commercial success. Tech Club broke even on their $6 million investment during the first week of sales. But also, during that time, more individuals and groups explored landscapes and spaces that we designed than will ever explore our built landscapes in my lifetime. So anyways, just interesting, cool project for an architecture team to design like a virtual world with the same kind of care and attention that they would give to a real one. I wish I could add a final section to this video devoted to the most important question of all, which is, of course, what time is it on the island of the Witness? But even though, and you might be despairing at this, be like, well, yeah, it's obviously just like daytime because the sun is up, but how could we know, right? Like maybe this is as high as the sun gets, and it's like the summer solstice day, and it's noon, but like we're just at a high latitude, or maybe we're at the equator, and the sun's just gonna derpily go like straight up, like in Minecraft, and then down the other side, and we're just like on the equator, and it's just mid morning, or whatever. But then I was like, oh, I actually have an edge here because the elite among Witness players, have noticed that Venus is in the game, and so like you have the plane of the ecliptic, like you know where the solar system is oriented and stuff, so we could figure this out. Except that actually the plane of the ecliptic is like different from the Earth's tilt. The Earth is tilted like 23.5 degrees away from how it's orbiting the solar system, and that just adds so much uncertainty, and whatever. And it could be either like morning or afternoon, of course, depending on whether the sun's going up or down. But I took like a cool like 360 photosphere of the Witness using the like NVIDIA Ansel incorporation, and I like reminded myself of a bunch of spherical geometry facts and like did a bunch of math and reminded myself about a bunch of astronomy. And I'm gonna spare you all that. In the end, the only thing that I can say really about the Witness is, if they were paying attention to this at all, if they were thinking at all about the fact that Venus is in line with the sun, then, or actually not, you don't even have to use that, but it does line up with this. The sun's height in the sky in degrees is like some random thing. It's like 46 point whatever degrees. It's not like 45 degrees. It's like 48 or something. Random height in the sky. So it's like, why did they put it there? Because obviously they have to choose that fairly early because it lines up with so many environmental puzzles on the island, and like buildings are aligned to it, and there's a bunch of shadows and things that have to do with sun's position. So they have to lock it in pretty early. Seems like it's just a random place. But it is, it's actually consistent with, like, if you had like a Minecraft sun that was just going straight up and then setting straight down, then it would just be at a random height. But if you had a sun that was like tilted so that it was kind of doing a more realistic curving arc across the sky, then if it was tilted by like 33 degrees, which would mean you're like a little bit above the tropics, like kind of in that Azores, Mediterranean, kind of Morocco type latitude, then if it's tilted exactly 33 degrees, which might be an easy number to put in, then it's also exactly 25% of the way through its arc. Like it's like 23, it's hard to illustrate this without hand gestures, but it's like 23 degrees, like the arc is tilted, and then the sun is like 25%, 50% it would be at its highest point in the sky, which would be like 2/3 of the way to the actual zenith, and then like 75%, and then it would set. So that's kind of nice. So it's either like 9 a.m. if it's morning, or it's like 3 p.m. if it's afternoon at like Azores latitude or whatever. If they were just punching in easy numbers, and which makes sense, because you might just like, you probably might in a game engine implement the sun. You might be thinking like, well, maybe we'll have real-time lighting, or maybe not. So you'd have like the spinny sun that could just go in a tilted circle And then you just like fix it and be like, well, maybe like 33 degrees and or like 30 degrees and 45 degrees sounds about right. But we don't know that for sure. So anyways, that wraps up all this episode about like the climate and the architecture details and the meteorology and all that. And I will see you soon for an episode about the civilizational history of the island. So definitely stay tuned for that one. It's going to be super cool.